So just checking my microphone and make like I'm a dog going, oh, oh. Okay, microphone works. So the other day I asked the question, given the USA is the world's biggest economy, and they have spent the last 80 years telling the world that they won World War II, and generally everything that they do is pretty gee whiz. Why is American booze so bad? That was the question I was asking. Why is American booze so bad? And go and watch that one. You'll come to my answer. It's going to give you the answer, but no, go and watch that. And you'll come to why I think American booze is so bad. Now, conversely, personal experience. I was in Europe last year. I spent 2 months in Spain and about a week all up in the UK and a couple of days in France. And my experience of European booze is that it's the diametric opposite to American booze. I will say I'm not a particularly big fan of European vodka, but I will also say that a bad European vodka is as good as the American best. And Tito's vodka is written up as being America's best vodka. And for me, I would seriously beg to disagree. Now, there is a reason why the European booze is so good, and because I'm a thinking man, I went looking for it. The reason why European booze is so good is because the European Parliament, I don't know the acronym for it, actually worked in a whole lot of rules on what constitute booze. So, and I'm looking at the AI overview from a 10-second search on Google. For the European laws, Regulation EU 2019/787, for those of you who want to look it up, defines, describes, and labels spirit drinks to ensure consumer protection and fair competition. The key production and category rules, and I'm saving you the problem of looking up Google, minimal alcoholic strength. Spirits must have a minimum alcoholic strength by volume of 15% or 14% for specific liqueurs and 10% for egg liqueurs, because I think much higher than 10%, and the alcohol literally cooks the egg. The geographical indications, so things like Scotch is going to be made in Scotland, cognac, tequila, ouzo are all trademarks. You're going to get tequila from Mexico, you're going to get ouzo out of Greece. A non-alcoholic alternative cannot use these protected names, even if they are preceded by words like alcohol-free or like. The AI then goes on to say sweetened products, if a spirit's sugar content exceeds specific limits, e.g. more than 10 grams per litre for vodka, it cannot use its generic category name and must be sold as a liqueur or spirit drink. So a sweetened vodka, like you've got 20% sugar in it, actually gets zapped down to a liqueur. The 700ml bottle is the standard, and there's a whole lot of labeling stuff. And that is the reason why the Europeans are so much better at this than the Americans. I know from dealing with German distillers in Melbourne, which has got a massive distilling scene, and I think it's generally the envy of Europe. So that in Germany, as much as we are aware of German beer purity laws, they actually also have indigenous German laws stating what constitutes what. So if you want to make schnapps, it has to be fruit-based. It can't be grain-based. It's got to be a certain percentage of alcohol. And there's, I think, I forget the conversation, but there are 2 or 3 very clear rules on what constitutes schnapps if you want to go making schnapps and calling what you've made schnapps. So it's got to have alcohol derived from fruit. It's got to be distilled, and I think there's a set number of fruit. You can't go having like butterscotch schnapps, for example, in Germany. In fact, when I contacted Schnapps ID with the idea of buying the stuff and interviewing them, I said, do you make butterscotch snaps? And they said, piss off, we're Germans. We don't do that garbage. So in Australia, you can make up butterscotch snaps, you can make up licorice snaps, whatever you want, and no one really gives a shit. You go and try that in Europe, they'll try and say, okay, schnapps doesn't have it isn't licorice based. You may be able to push it with strawberries, but you can't do with licorice or sugar cane. Or I'm thinking sweet potato, which the Japanese makes shoju out of, soju. So that's what constitutes snaps. So not only do we have very clear EU regulation going, if this is what you want to call something, this is what it has to contain. These are the ingredients. Vodka has to be a neutral spirit, and it has to be, minimum 37%, and you can't make it sweet. Bang, that's it. That's what the Europeans say. The Krauts will go on and say, okay, if you want to go making schnapps with the indigenous German firewater, this is what you need. Bang, bang, bang. You get into Serbia and start dealing with rakia and slivovitz, and it's the same thing. It's fruit thing. So, but unlike America, and the Europeans, with their clarity of rules, don't have the economies don't have the ability to dump excess subsidized grain into their spirits, because I think Europe's got a slightly smaller population than the US, but it doesn't have farmers who are subsidized producing a couple of billion tons of corn that they've got to do something with. So the Europeans are far more tighter in their regulation than the Americans. I also strongly suspect that, given the German pedanticness and general EU pedanticness, that the Europeans are actually paying far more attention to their alcohol. So when it comes to the methanol, which is the beginning and the end of it, which is generally where some questionable stuff comes in, the Germans are far more likely to turn the wood spirit, the methanol, into metho and sell it as metho than what they are to keep it in a bottle, which removes that horrible burn that nearly every American spirit I've ever tried has. And it's, for me, it's just extremely disagreeable. Moving on to beer, the Germans are well known, and they're perhaps the best known example of their beer purity laws, because back in the 16th century, the Krauts were producing some pretty awful stuff and calling it beer. So they were working in potatoes and sweet potatoes and sunflowers and all the shit and saying, "Das ist beer." And everyone was getting poisoned, and just, it was vile. So eventually some anal retentive, I think in Bayern, Bavaria, said, no, if we're going to call this stuff beer, it has to have grain-based, it has to be fermented, and it's got to hit this thing. It's got to look brown and do other things that we can establish as beer. This is the basis. If you want to go off and call, it beer or something else beer, we're not going to accept it. We're not. If you try to sell it as beer, we're going to jump all over your head and be unpleasant. And that's what. And I think generally Europe has followed on from that. Once the Krauts, who are dominant economically and politically in Europe and have been for quite a while now, start setting the standard of, this is what we're going to call beer. We won't, if you want to go whacking cannabis into it, and they were whacking cannabis into the beer at one point, you have to call it something else. If you want to go creating a wheat beer, it has to set this set formula, this number of ingredients. This is what you have to do. And this is the reason why, my friends, I think that European products are so much better. And having the old grey matter turn, I might actually get on, follow this up with, why is my crowd producing such amazing spirits? And well, I'm a proud Aussie, and I drink an awful lot of Aussie spirits because, Aussie, not Aussie, which is also in French. Thank you very much for watching. Love the comments, and I'll do more of these things. Remember, Odin does drinks. Thanks. Bye.